So hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us. We are so excited to be partnering with our students from Texas Votes who have an amazing presentation and will be sharing some really important resources and information as it pertains to voting, what preparation looks like. They have a lot of good content and we hope that you all enjoy this time as well as ask any questions that you may have in the chat. They will be around to respond and provide any information that you need. I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Janae and the rest of the Texas Votes team to introduce themselves and begin their presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janae, president of Texas Votes. It's so nice to meet you all. We're going to go around and do introductions just really fast while I am setting up screen share. Zoe.
Oh, is that me? All right. Hi, I am Zoe. I am the Chief Volunteer Deputy Registrar of Texas Votes.
Hi, I'm Mahi. I am the chair of the Civic Engagement Alliance, headed by Texas Votes.
Hi, I'm Krista. I'm the program coordinator for Texas Votes.
And we are so excited to be here. Thank you all for inviting us. We're just super excited to be here. We love talking about voter education and civic engagement, so let's just get into it. So who is Texas Votes? Texas Votes is a nonpartisan civic engagement org here at UT. We're devoted to registering, educating, and encouraging Longhorns to turn out to vote in each and every election. We're an award-winning organization. We have nationwide recognition in conferences and competitions for our efforts to get Longhorns registered to vote. We don't care how you vote, just that you do it. So today we're going to go ahead and make sure everyone is registered to vote, knows how to do that, and is also ready for the general election.
So I know it's cliche, but voting really is important because it's one of the tangible ways to enact change in your community and make your voice heard. While other forms of civic engagement, such as protesting, debates, activism, they're all fundamental to our democracy. But without following that up with your vote, it's difficult to actually have change. More than that, voting is your right and a fundamental tool to creating changes that you want to see for your community, state, and nation. Especially at the local level, elections do make a difference. While people usually overlook local races in favor of the US Congress and the presidential election, city and local races are decided by as little as 43 votes sometimes. So your decision makes a big impact. And another benefit of focusing on local elections is that they're not affected by the Electoral College. Candidates on the ballots for races in the state legislature also play a huge role in government, even though mostly they're not focused on. They determine how much money the state spends on education, infrastructure, tax rates, and more. Additionally, they set state laws, which largely determine your rights and the content of a lot of regulations for most state-based industries and activities, including this university. One of the races on the ballot this November is the member of your Austin City Council, who affects everything from housing affordability to transportation to policing. In fact, this November, there will also be a ballot proposition here in Austin, which, if passed, could significantly affect public transit. Search up Project Connect if you'd like to learn more. Candidates on the ballot for judicial elections determine which crimes to prosecute and are major players in contributing to or reforming the criminal justice system. State Board of Education candidates will determine what goes on our school's curriculum, and Texas Supreme Court candidates, who are going to be in the highest authority in state court, will perform the majority of prosecutions in the state. Finally, the Railroad Commission, which despite its name has nothing to do with railroads, will serve as the chief environmental regulator in the state. These races really do matter, and these candidates really have the power to affect the things that so many young people care about. And here's the thing, The data shows that once someone votes once, they're way more likely to do so again. It becomes second nature. And at UT, with 84% of students being registered, as we like to say, what starts here changes the world.
Thank you, Mahi. So as Mahi said, voting is very important. There's a lot of different issues on this ballot. And it's important not only because the races on the ballot have a really direct impact on you, your family, your community, but it's also important to vote because it has been a several centuries long struggle to have the right to vote universally and to have the protections in place that we currently have. So just going to go through the long and tumultuous history of voting in America. As you can tell, as we get closer to today's date, more protected rights are enacted for minorities. But it wasn't always this way, and it wasn't this way for the vast majority of our history. So starting at the very beginning, 1607, Jamestown, colonial America under England and also the early Republic, only property-owning white male citizens were allowed to vote. Moving on to 1790, there's a small typo here. It's the Naturalization Act of 1790, not 1970. But the Naturalization Act of 1790 allowed foreign-born white males to become citizens and thus have the right to vote. And some state laws still delayed this actual expansion. From around 1790 to just before the Civil War, you had gradual divestment state by state of the property requirements for white men to vote. So you saw it expanded where non-property owning white males were allowed to vote as well. Of course, you had the Civil War, and following immediately after the Civil War, you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which respectively freed slaves, expanded citizenship and civil rights, and granted freedmen the right to vote. However, it granted these rights in name only, and several states, including Texas, passed severe and extremely restrictive Jim Crow laws to discriminate against Black voters. And voter disenfranchisement and voter suppression became the norm. Going on from the end of the Civil War all the way to a century after 1965, Jim Crow laws in states remained intact, as did statewide poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, anything and everything you're thinking of that can stop people from voting, such as coercion or assault, was not only allowed, but sometimes the norm in many polling stations across several states. And from 1869 to 1896, it was actually in our state constitution that there was a poll tax of $1 on men ages 21 to 60. And of note, it's not $1 our time, it was significantly more back then. So this was a real, not only like common hindrance to voting, but it was also legalized, codified. It was the norm in all ways, including legal. Okay, 1887, you have the Dawes Act, which allowed Native Americans to technically gain full citizenship and the right to vote, so long as they completely disassociate from their tribe. This was a part of a long history of assimilation efforts against Native Americans. So even though you had this on paper right to vote so long as disassociation occurs, threats, poll taxes, and sometimes states just full out refusing to extend these rights to Native Americans persisted. At 1902, the start of the 20th century, a constitutional amendment allows for a poll tax of $1.50 to $1.75 to occur in the state. And then 1913, just before World War I, you have the 17th Amendment, which was an expansion of accessibility and direct voting for our representatives. So the 17th Amendment allows direct representation or direct election of federal senators instead of voters electing their state legislatures and then their state legislatures electing their federal senators and their state senators. So that was an expansion of direct impact on voting. In 1920, just after World War I, you had Texas ratifying the 19th Amendment, which allowed women's suffrage. Of note, this was only white women. And yeah, it was only white women. There's nothing else to say there. So at this point, we are just about a century back in time. only non-property owning white men and women were allowed to vote. And Native Americans in writing, if they completely disassociated from their tribes, were allowed to vote, but this was not a protected right. This was not something that could actually occur. In 1924, you had the Snyder Act, in which all Native Americans gain citizenship and the right to vote, even if they don't disassociate with their tribe. However, of note, just like I previously said, poll taxes, coercion, harassment, threats still persisted, and this was not a fully protected right to vote. From 1949 to 1963, the Texas Senate attempted twice to repeal the poll tax in their constitution and failed both times. In 1952, you had the McCarran-Walter Act, which granted full citizenship and the right to vote to Asian Americans. However, of note, harassment, poll taxes, all of these things still persisted, so this was not a fully protected right to vote. In 1964, you had the 24th Amendment, which universally across the board in the nation prohibited poll taxes for federal elections. However, you had several states, including Texas and 4 others, who persisted in allowing poll taxes to occur. There was no enforcement, there was no real punishment for violations of this amendment. A year later, in 1965, you had the largest and just sweeping voting rights reform happened in the nation. You had unprecedented protection of voter registration and voting rights for minorities. So this was the first piece of legislation that granted actual rights to vote for minorities and for women of color. This was the very first one. However, you still had, even though it was technically unconstitutional, you still had harassment, you still had coercion, you still had all of these things happening. And in 1966, so 2 years after the 24th Amendment, Texas officially ended poll taxes for local and state elections, but they did not formally approve this amendment in the state legislature until about a decade ago. So in 1971, you had the voting, the age to vote expanded. It went from 21 to 18. This was largely stemming from the Vietnam War, in which 18-year-olds were often drafted or enlisted to fight abroad, but were not actually able to vote for the representatives who voted for them to go and fight overseas. So this was another big expansion of people who are able to vote. So if you are anywhere between the age of 18 to 21, this is one of many pieces of legislation that likely granted you the right to vote. And then in 1975, you had an amendment to the Voting Rights Act, which granted protections and specified protections against harassment and intimidation that was especially experienced by Hispanics in the South whenever they tried to vote. So I know that was a long, difficult timeline to get through, probably not the most fun thing to talk about, but it is very important that we understand our long and tumultuous history and also understand that the rights that we have today to vote have been fought for with blood, sweat, and tears, quite literally, and is something that people in the past worked really hard for and would really, really want you to go out and vote. Also of note, the history of voting rights doesn't end in 1975 for America. Texas Votes is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy civic engagement group at UT, meaning we can't really get into voting rights issues from 1975 till now because they're deeply partisan, deeply advocacy associated. So just know that there are still things going on, there's still fights happening, there's still things that people are trying to work on to protect voting rights, but just that we cannot be the group to tell you about them. So please, 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 all of the links for all of these pieces of legislation and also any resources in this slide are linked in the speaker's notes of each slide. So please feel free to do some research, continue looking into how you can be a part of this. Okay.
So like Janae said, that was pretty heavy, but one reason why a lot of people are motivated to vote is because they're voting for all of those who were barred from exercising that right before, and to ensure that those who come after them can continue to have equal access to voting. However, another thing that may motivate you, and a bit more lighthearted, is beating OU. What starts here really does change the world, and UT Austin students consistently beat the state average voting rate. And more importantly, we always beat OU with their voting rate. In 2016, UT students had a voting rate of 56.5%, and it only went down to 54.8% in 2018. This is an extremely small dip from a presidential election to a midterm election, especially compared to the states overall and other normal trends. So the perception of young people not voting does not hold true for UT students, and our goal is to continue breaking those records in 2020 and beyond. Next slide. So the next big election where you can exercise your right to vote is happening this November. While I'm sure you've heard about the presidential election, in Texas, we're also going to be voting for one of our senators. Every representative in the House is up for election, and that's not to mention all of the city, county, and other local races that will determine who makes important decisions that affect your life, the decisions that we talked about earlier. You can use vote411.org to find out exactly what's going to be on your ballot. On this website, you'll also find nonpartisan information about candidates so you can decide who to vote for. So just quickly going over some deadlines. The last day to register to vote for the November election is October 5th. And if you register today, right after watching this, or even during it, you won't even have to think about that deadline. Something you should pay a lot of attention to, though, is the deadline to have your absentee ballot application received, which is 23rd. If you decide to vote by mail, be careful about this deadline because it's not enough to mail in your application by the 23rd. It has to be received by the county then. And if you decide to vote in person, early voting is October 13th to the 30th, and election day is November 3rd. We'll go into more details about all of this later on in the presentation.
All right, so the first step of voting is going to be making sure you're registered to vote. Very, very important. It's important to note that today we're going to be talking specifically about voter registration in Texas. If you're planning on getting registered or updating your registration in other states, you will have to do some research on your own state's laws as these vary and can change what you can and cannot do. For example, in Texas, we do not have online or same-day voter registration. Which some other states do, which is important to take note when you're planning your voter registration. It's also important to consider where you're physically going to get registered, which location that is, because that will determine not only who you're voting on, but where you can go vote and things like that. So it's important to decide whether you're going to vote on at your home address or your school address. All right, so like I said, there is no online voter registration in Texas. These are just some important things to note. There's no online voter registration in Texas. So unless you have physically signed a voter registration form and then subsequently either mailed that in or given that to a volunteer deputy registrar who can take that to the county for you, you have not registered to vote in Travis County. So that's important to note that you do need to have some physical in-person interaction with your form to be registered. And like I said, there's also no same day voter registration, which means that registering to vote does take a little bit of time and planning ahead because you can't simply do it on election day. This deadline is traditionally 30 days before an election, which for us is October 5th. So it's coming up very, very soon. And these are important things to consider when you're debating not only how you're going to get registered and when you're going to register, but also where you're going to register, because some of these require a bit of planning and can impact your access to the polls when you do go to vote.
So kind of adding on to what Zoe was talking about, where you register to vote is very important and actually really influential in what shows up on your ballot, because where you register to vote is where you vote for, or where you vote in rather. So it's really ultimately your decision where you register to vote. We would encourage you to weigh the pros and cons. You know, where do you identify most with your community? What issues are happening that you're most passionate about? If you're like, man, I really have to vote for Travis County DA this election. I feel really passionately for or against candidates, or I really support them or I don't. Then maybe you want to register to vote in Travis County. If you don't really care either way, or you just want to make sure that you vote and that your voice is heard and you don't really have a preference, we would also recommend that you take into account convenience, and also tacking onto this, for everyone, please plan what you will do if campus gets shut down. So if you're living on campus and the possibility of you having to go back to Dallas or wherever your back home county is, That's a really important thing for you to take into note, because if you are planning on voting in person in Travis County and then we get sent home and you have to go back to DFW or Houston or wherever, or out of state even, that's going to impact your ability to vote in person in Travis County. So overall, we recommend please take that into account. And if you, for instance, are living on campus and that is that's like a possibility for you, we would recommend that you vote wherever you would be able to vote in person. So if for instance, if I got sent home to Travis or to Tarrant County, I would want to register to vote in Tarrant County and then request an absentee ballot, because as of right now, I don't plan on being there to vote during the period of elections, which we'll get into in a little bit later. But just overall, start thinking, what am I going to do if we do get sent home and I'm not able to vote in Austin or wherever I am? Or alternatively, if you live in West Campus or off campus and it doesn't really matter if campus gets shut down, that's also something to keep in mind, because then you have a little bit more leeway. So overall, where do you identify most with? Are you passionate about voting in one county versus the other? And where is most convenient for you? And most importantly, where is it possible for you to vote? So feel free to think on that for a little bit. But because you are technically a full-time resident of both Travis County because you attend school here, and if you are from somewhere else that isn't Travis County, you're also a full-time resident there, you are able to vote in either one. You can pick. You do have to have a permanent residence in both. So if you're like an incoming freshman who has never lived in Austin before, you will have to vote back home. That was very complicated. So if you have any questions, feel free to send it in the chat. But we will also talk about this a little bit more. Okay, turbo vote. So Zoe told you there's no such thing as online voter registration, which is 100% true. I'm sure you've seen websites like Register to Vote or vote.org, things like that, that are online tools to make it a little bit easier to get registered to vote in states that don't have online voter registration. And Turbo Vote is one of those tools, but we have paid for Turbo Vote specifically for UT students to try to take some of the hassle out of getting registered to vote. So Turbo Vote is really great, and I will go into that in just a little bit. But first things first, if you don't know if you're registered to vote or you don't even know where you're registered to vote at, you can check right here at this bit.ly link. It'll take you to the Texas Secretary of State's website. And again, we're going to send out the slideshow to everyone, so don't worry too much right now. And here's some reasons why you would need to register or get re-registered to vote if you've never registered to vote before, if you've changed your first or your last name since the last time you voted, if you've moved since the last time you voted. So let's say you lived on campus, now you live off campus, you're in a completely different congressional district, you have a different representative entirely, you have to re-register. Alternatively, let's say you lived in Unit 101, you moved to Unit 102, you still have to re-register. So changing congressional district is not what triggers you having to re-registering, it's you moving at all. Just important note. And also, if you were registered in a different county, so I was registered in Tarrant County this past election, but now I want to vote in Travis County, I would have to register to change my registration status to be able to vote in that different county that I want to vote in. So Turbo Vote is super simple, super easy. It takes like 5 minutes, honestly. It's the easiest way to do this. Basically, what Turbo Vote is they ask you a couple questions: name, birthday, are you registered to vote, stuff like that. And then it will pre-fill out that first half of your voter registration form. And then it will say, hey, can we mail this to you? Important note, if you're doing this before September 21st, go ahead and say yes. Say yes, please mail it to me. And that's really helpful because it comes pre-addressed, so you don't even have to look up who to send this to. And it comes with prepaid postage, so you don't have to have stamps. And because they're mailing it to you, you don't have to print it. So it's really like the most hassle-free way to get registered. However, if you wait a little bit, or if you're not seeing this presentation until on or after the 21st of September, you should go ahead and print this out. And the reason why we're differentiating is because we're concerned that postal delays and general county capacity may not allow you to get or receive your form in time unless you print this out. So just to err on the side of safety, if you're doing this before the 21st of September, yes, they can mail it to you. It's a great option. If you're doing this after, please print it out and mail it to them, just to ensure that everything gets there long before the 5th. So that is our advice. But regardless of how you do it, whether you have it mailed to you or print it out, you are going to fill in the bottom half, so your name, the day's date, anything else that might apply, with blue or black pen, and then you're going to mail it to the address provided. So even if you choose the printout option, TurboVote will tell you where to send it. So you don't have to think about that regardless, which is nice. But yeah, big asterisk, bold, underline, exclamation point. October 5th is the last day to get registered to vote. And again, postal delays, county capacity, you want to get this done as soon as possible. Like today would be a great day to do it. And if you have any questions at all, we will be here afterwards. And we also have a hotline that you can text that we will mention as well. Okay. I think this is also me. Hello. So this is just another emphasis of September 21st. If you're doing it before, have it mail it to you. If you're doing it after, print it out. We really want to make sure that you guys are getting registered to vote, because that's the first step of being able to do any of the super cool, amazing stuff that comes with voting. So please make sure that you mark this in your calendar. September 21st is really not that far away. So I would recommend you guys do this ASAP, because then you have to think about it a lot less.
All right, and once you have made sure you're registered to vote, now you can start planning for how you're gonna vote. There are two main methods by which you can vote in this upcoming election. There's gonna be in-person and absentee voting. In terms of in-person voting, you have a bit of flexibility in terms of when you actually go to vote. You've got that entire early voting period, which is October 13th through 30th, as well as Election Day, which is November 3rd. We love early voting, and we encourage anyone who's going to be voting in person to consider doing it during early voting, especially if you can go on like a weekend morning, because early voting does include weekends, to avoid long lines, which is nice just to be able to get in and out quickly, but also to avoid any large crowds, which we're worried about these days. So it's important to consider doing that and avoid those large groups. And there are safety measures that are being taken. These differ from county to county. But in terms of Travis County, you've got things like PPE, sanitizer, masks, things like that. So that for those who are in-person voting, there are measures being taken to increase your safety when you go to vote. And then the other option is absentee voting, which you do need to meet the eligibility requirements to do, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But some of the benefits of this include getting to vote from the comfort of home, not having the risk of getting sick or anything like that, or being around too many people. But this one does require planning ahead, which we are going to talk about coming up. All right, so eligibility. If you are hoping to vote by mail, it's important to note that you must meet at least one of the following requirements. You must be 65 or older, be disabled, be out of the county on Election Day, which is November 3rd, and during the entire period of early voting, October 13th through 30th, or be confined in jail but otherwise eligible. These are the requirements. You have to meet at least one of these. A couple important notes: the state of Texas does not currently consider fear of catching COVID as a disability or reason to vote by mail. So that's something to take note of. The other thing is that the being out of the county on Election Day is going to be the thing that for most college students gives them that qualification of voting by mail, which is why it's so important to decide where you are going to vote. Because depending on if you choose where you are currently versus your other address, that will enable you to absentee vote if that's something that you want to do. So it's important to decide between the two.
Great, so I'm just going to be talking about that absentee voting process. This is definitely kind of a scarier part of the voting process, but it's obviously really important this year. And once you learn the steps, it's really not that difficult or scary anymore. So there's really 4 steps to absentee voting. The first one is that you need to first obtain a vote by mail application. So you can use these links, or you can request that the form be mailed to you. So after you get that, you want to send in your vote by mail application, and you can use these helpful links here to kind of guide you through that process. And someone forward the slide. Thank you. So after you do that, you'll receive your ballot in the mail, and you can fill it out with your votes. Definitely make sure that you're voting in every race. That's really important. And after you're done filling it out, you want to actually return it to your county. So you'll mail your ballot to the same person address as in step 2. It's definitely really important to do all of these steps as soon as possible. You want to make sure that your vote is counted and that you get everything in on time. And of course, we're all students and stressed, so don't put that pressure on yourself to have to do it at the last minute and be worried. Thank you. So as far as voting in person goes, voting in person happens during 2 periods. Oh, this is Mahi. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's fine. Like Krista was saying, there's 2 ways you can vote, either on election day, which is November 3rd, or during early voting, which is October 13th to the 30th. We highly, highly recommend that you vote during early voting because, like Zoe said earlier, you'll be exposed to far less people. And especially if you go in the early mornings during early voting, there'll be almost nobody there. So that would be convenient. You can find out where you can vote at bit.ly/Texas polling places. And one thing you should remember when you're checking this is that both polling locations and times can be different between early voting and election day. So be sure to check what you're looking at when you see the places that you can vote. When you do go to vote, remember to take an acceptable form of ID. Like you see in the image, there are 7 possible forms, but most people can use their Texas driver's license or a US passport. One thing to remember is that usually you get a voter registration card in the mail about 30 days after you get registered. You do not need that little card when you're going to vote. That's just for your own information.
Yeah, it usually takes them exactly 30 days to get it to you. So if you were to register hypothetically today, you might not get it in time before early voting. So it takes them usually exactly 30 days, which is super fun, but you don't need it. It's not necessary. If you haven't gotten it, that doesn't mean that you aren't registered to vote. That doesn't mean that you can't vote. It simply means county has just not gotten to it yet. But you are still registered to vote and you can vote. And alternatively, if you do get it, that's great. You should bring it because it will probably make the process a little bit faster. But if you don't have it, it's nothing to stress about.
So as of today, we have 47 days until election day, but the most important number is that we have 26 days until early voting starts, which is October 13th. So if you plan to vote in person, it's best to make a plan now about how and when you're going to vote in person. Like I said earlier, you can use the bit.ly Texas polling places link to find out where you can vote. While if you go now, you will see many polling locations. They can change at any time until a short period before voting starts. So wait until October to see the finalized locations, but also the day before you go vote, check the website again to make sure that the polling location you plan to go to is still open and that the timing is the same. This is all just to be safe, and so you don't waste your time, go somewhere and then it's not open. If you're living on campus, we're going to have 2 polling locations, one at the FAC and one at the Gregory Gym. So that will be convenient for you. So when you do actually go vote, like I said earlier, remember to take a valid voter ID and a printed or written list of ballot choices because you won't be able to take your phone out when you're voting. And there might be a lot of races. So if you don't want to memorize every single person you want to vote for, just having it on paper makes it easy. One way you can do this is the website we mentioned earlier, vote411.org. If you go there, put in your address, they'll give you all of the races that are going to be on your ballot. You can make your selections, and if you print it out, all of your choices are right there. You can just easily vote. One thing is that if you want to check what the polling times, the waiting times are at the polling place, Travis County actually has a neat little website that you can use. So that will make it even more convenient for you to vote.
Also important, we actually just got an announcement about this a couple days ago. The FAC and Greg Gym will be polling stations on campus that you can vote at in person. And one of the questions that we got in the chat, yes, even if you don't live on campus, you still can vote at an on-campus polling location. So if you live in West Campus or North Campus or anywhere in Travis County, you can vote at an on-campus polling location. And we also have had it confirmed that even if campus shuts down, there will still be at least one on-campus polling location that remains open. So that's good to know. Should make everyone feel a little bit more relieved that there will be some kind of consistency with how things have been going.
I'm going to talk about some ways that you can get involved beyond voting. So civic engagement obviously involves, but is never limited to just voting. Something you can do to help out your community is filling out the US Census. So really the purpose of the census, because most of us probably weren't paying attention when it happened 10 years ago, is really just to get a count of the number and demographics of people in your community to make sure that resources are distributed equitably and fairly according to the population. So the census determines funding for all kinds of things that are important to our daily lives, even things like roads, schools, and where healthcare facilities are built. The deadline for this year is September 30th, and you fill it out based on where you lived or what your household was on April 1st. So if you are a freshman this year, you were most likely living at home on April 1st. So your family may have already filled this out. I would just take some time, figure out where you would have lived. If you were living with family, ask them if they filled out the census. If not, offer to do it for your family and your household. It's really important. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's also really important that you contact your reps to tell them what you're passionate about. I know it could definitely seem scary, but they're there to represent you. They will not feel annoyed if you call them up, and even if they do, that's what their job is. Their job is to listen to you and to hear your voice. And as college students, we often will have two sets of representatives. You have those who will represent you when you're living on campus, and then you'll have those who represent you back home. Probably one of the most difficult parts of the process is just being on top of who your representatives are at all levels. These links are really helpful. You can go to them and it'll tell you exactly who you need to contact and how you can contact them. Just remember that your representative's job is to take your values into account. They're there to defend what you like, but they won't know what your beliefs are until you tell them. So just definitely don't forget to contact them if there's an issue that you feel passionately about.
And as someone who works in a Texas Ledge office, they do actually keep track of it. It does actually have an impact on how they vote. They might not always vote in the way that you want, but that is some sort of tracker of, okay, if I don't vote the way that my constituents want, they will not be happy with me. They won't reelect me. So it does matter. It does have an impact. Fully feel empowered to harass your representatives. That's what they're there for.
Definitely. Also, a great way you can get involved is by becoming a poll worker. So most election years, poll workers are typically staffed by older individuals, but obviously this year with COVID, a lot of those people are not able to serve. That way they're not exposed since they're a vulnerable population. So it's on us as college students to help them fill the gap. It's problematic because if there's not enough poll workers, we could lose access to polling stations and not have enough staff or voters. It's also important because if there's not enough poll workers, there can be longer lines and sometimes people won't feel encouraged to vote. So just making sure that we're supporting the accessibility of polling stations. That's especially vital to low income and minority voters because those polling locations often see more capacity. And so you can use this link to sign up as a poll worker. It's really easy. You will get contacted with all the directions of what you need to do to get trained and to sign up. It's a one-day commitment and you get paid. So you can defend democracy and get paid at the same time. Easy. If you don't feel like you can commit to getting a campus job, you could still make a pretty good amount of money with a one-day commitment.
And we had a question that was related to this, talking about if I'm not registered in Travis County, can I still be a poll worker for Travis County? The answer is, I believe so. But if you'll text our hotline, which I think is the very next slide, we will be able to call the county and double check just to make sure that all our ducks are in a row with that. Okay, yes, I predicted right. So that was a lot of information thrown at you in a very short amount of time. This number right here, 512-814-5401. This is our voting hotline. If you or anyone you know that's voting in the state of Texas has any questions, please feel free to text this number. The entire purpose of our org, as you can see, is voting. We are very passionate about voter education and encouraging people to vote. So please, there's no such thing as stupid questions. It's always better to ask and know than not ask and potentially be disenfranchised. So please don't hesitate to share this with everyone you know. We have our social media linked here. We post all kinds of graphics. We post updates on polling stations, just really anything and everything about voting. We post on all of our social medias. This is also our email that you can feel free to reach out to if you have questions. And if you encounter any obstacles to voting or anything of the sort, this is the Election Protection Hotline number. They are the people who can tell you what you should do as next steps. And they are also the people who can potentially escalate anything into a bigger legal matter. But any and all of your questions, we'll probably be able to answer most of them here. And if not, we can call counties. We can ask our contacts in the county and at the state for actual answers given by the government so that we know for sure that we're telling you the right thing. But yeah, that was our presentation. And if you have any questions, we would absolutely love to take any. If you're interested in joining us, we take members at any and all times. It's as little or as much commitment as you want. So if you think this could be interesting or something that you are excited about, this is the bit.ly link to join. But yeah, if you have any questions, we will take them now. Maybe I should have kept screen sharing. My US passport unfortunately expired and I haven't been able to renew it. Since most offices are still closed, will I not be able to vote, or can I use a birth certificate? So I'm not sure what the regulation with expired passports is. I know that with driver's license, if it's expired for less than 4 years, that is an acceptable form of voter ID. Zoe, do you know, have you heard anything about passports?
Yeah, so according to the Secretary of State's website, any valid form of ID, so long as it's not a US citizenship certificate, can be expired up to 4 years and still be a valid form of ID. If it's expired more than 4 years, it does not work. Or if it's specifically a citizenship certificate and it's expired, then it doesn't work. But yes, a US passport that is less than 4 years expired should be a valid form of ID.
Okay, amazing. Another question. I already registered to vote last year, and right now I'm staying home with the same address I used to register. I don't have to register again, right? So if you want to register at your back home county, which I think you're currently registered at and you're currently living at, no, you're good to go. You're still registered. If you would like to vote, if you have a permanent residence in Austin or any other county besides your back home county that you would like to vote in, you are eligible to re-register and to vote absentee there, but it's entirely your choice. We are putting a heavy preference on, or a heavy recommendation on, people voting in person, because then we know for sure that you are able to vote where you are, and you don't have to necessarily worry about postal delays, county capacity. But again, it's really whatever your preference is, whatever you're passionate about, whatever's most convenient for you.
Just one thing I want to add to that. You're probably still registered there, but I would go to bit.ly/textreg and check if you're still registered, just to be safe.
And if any questions come up after we leave, that is also totally okay. Oh, I'm gonna send the slides in the chat really quickly for everyone. That way you guys have it even after we're gone. And this has, like I said, all the references that we mentioned, everything from the voting history to the actual TurboVote link, all of that kind of stuff. It's all in this it's all in this Google slide. And then our hotline for any questions that may come up, because I know I get shy at webinars, so that's our hotline. So if you have any questions, feel free to text that. You can text at whatever time. We will respond at a reasonable hour, but it's okay if it's a Google Voice number. It's fine. And also, if you don't have access to one of those 7 forms of accessible voter ID that we had up on that slide, there are other ways to prove that you're a resident of the county, things like utility bills, things like that. I would call the county that you're trying to vote in and just double check that you're bringing everything that you need. But if you don't have one of those 7, that doesn't mean you can't vote. It just means you might have to bring something else. Webinars are kind of weird. I've never done one before. if you had a question that we weren't able to fully flesh out or really get to, you can unmute now. You can send in the chat anonymously, whatever you'd like. And then also 512-814-5401. We check this religiously. We check it multiple times a day. So please feel free to text that number. And even if we don't know the answer, we will call county officials who for sure do.
Awesome. Well, it doesn't seem like we have any questions, but I just want to say thank you to all of you for being present with us and sharing this very, very valuable and helpful information as all of our students are preparing to possibly vote for the first time in a presidential election. I know that it will be very helpful for them to know. We will be posting this video link onto our Canvas page with all of the resources that you all have shared today so that students can access them. And you all have, shared the contact information for if they have any questions. So again, we want to say thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having us. We encourage everyone turn out to vote and also, advocate for your beliefs, fight for what you want your representatives to pass legislation on. Vote. We don't care how you do it. We don't care what issues you support. Just make sure that you're being vocal and you're being heard and you're taking advantage of the right that you have to make sure that you're heard in every election.
Thank you all so much. It was really informative. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Y'all have a good rest of your day.
You too. We'll talk to y'all later.